everyone, it's Librarian Faith from the Mandel Public Library of West Palm Beach. And today, I'm going to show you how to make an ombre dip-dyed yarn. Let's get started, shall we? You'll need a couple of things in order to do this project. Firstly, you'll need 100% cotton yarn. The reason we're using 100% cotton yarn is that it works with the dye I have, grit, a little bit better than a synthetic would. Also, I want to use this yarn to make a pot holder later on, and if I use a synthetic, I won't be able to expose it to heat, whereas cotton is totally fine with heat. You'll also need a pair of scissors, some saran wrap, a bucket or anything that's watertight, and some dye. Now, I'm reusing the dye I used in the tie-dye video last week. I had a lot left over, so I thought this could be a fun way to reuse it. The first thing you'll want to do is unspool enough yarn for whatever project you'd like to do. Then we'll need to rewrap the yarn in whatever length we need in order to do the project. Then, you'll want to make a circle that's about however long you want it to be. I usually recommend a little bit longer rather than a little bit shorter. And once you have your length, you'll just start wrapping the yarn. Once you have the length you like, I recommend getting 2 different objects and putting them on either end of the circle. It makes it a little bit easier to wrap the yarn up with. This project is especially easy if you have a second person to help you do it, but I'm just by myself here in the studio. That's why I wasn't wearing a mask during the intro. So I'm making it work. Okay, we'll call that about enough. Now we have our yarn ready for dye. Now, this part is wonderfully simple. You'll take your bucket, put your dye in your bucket with the top off. You'll take your yarn and an optional safety pin. Don't have to, but it is an easy way to keep all of the yarn together. You just put it around your yarn. That way it stays as a circle. Then you'll do as the title suggests and dip your yarn into the dye and let it go down a little bit. And you'll lay the rest out in the bucket. You can already see that some of the dye is seeping up the yarn, which is a perfect thing. We'll leave it in there overnight and let the dye slowly absorb and crawl up the cotton yarn. Now the dye has set overnight. You can see it looks a bit rough right now, but that's because the dye has traveled up the yarn and then back down through to give us the ombre effect. The next step is removing the yarn from the dye. Make sure you put the lid back on your leftover dye. You don't want that spilling over anything. Now we're going to wrap the yarn in saran wrap. Make sure you keep the yarn long ways, then wrap around it. And also, make sure you take that safety pin out before you put it in the microwave. Don't want to set your microwave on fire. We want to preserve the ombre as much as we can. So keep it long ways like this. And you can fold it over and make sure it fits nicely in your microwave. So I'm going to put this in there for 1 minute and I'll be right back. Now that the yarn is out of the microwave and it's cool to the touch, we can go to the next step. So you'll want to unwrap it. And look at this little hole here. That's why I had a little bit of dye in my microwave. Something to be mindful of. Open it up. And throw this part away. We'll reattach our safety pin. Once again, make sure you take the safety pin out before you put it in the microwave. We don't want any exploding microwaves. And we'll put it back in our bucket. Because now, we need to go to a sink and wash it out. I recommend using some sort of dishwash and just making sure you rinse it out until there's no more dye coming in the water. Okay, we're gonna call this about good. Typically you'll want to wash out the dye until it runs clear, but as long as you throw this in the washing machine before you use it, it'll still be fine. Now that we have our yarn washed, we can go ahead and hang it up to dry. Now you could hang it up just like this, but I like spreading it out a little bit more so that you can dry a little bit more quickly. Let's move on. We're gonna MacGyver it a little bit over here and just hang it up on the back of these chairs. You might have noticed that the lightest part of the yarn was initially almost white, but now it's a very light to medium pink. This is totally okay. This happened when I was washing out the yarn and the dye from the darkest part started interacting with the part that wasn't very much dyed at all. If you want it to maintain that crisp white, you'll want to be more careful when washing, making sure to only wash the darkest part and keeping the lighter part away from the dye-infused water. However, I kind of like this gradient a little bit better. You can see that I've laid the yarn out to dry a little bit. When you lay it out like this, it'll dry much faster, which can be very handy. We'll just let it sit here for about an hour or two, then it'll be ready to wind up. And here's how it turns out. Doesn't it look nice? Now admittedly, this is from a previous batch. But next week, I'll be showing everyone how to make a crocheted pot holder, and we'll be using both this skein and the skein we made today, so you'll be able to see exactly how it turns out. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure to tune in next week for another crafting how-to. And until then, happy reading!